Hello, this is Mrs. Molina, and today we are going to learn about the work of a gentleman named Gregor Mendel. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the amazing discoveries he made during his time, but in order to understand that, we need to understand a couple of words. So I'm going to start off with the first word, okay, which is genetics. Mendel didn't call it genetics at the time, but we know what he studied today to be genetics. And what that is the scientific study of heredity. And you might be going, what, Miss Molina? That doesn't make sense because I don't know what heredity is. Well, let me define that for you. Heredity is simply the passing of characteristics from parents to offspring. Now, offspring is a general term that we use for, in humans, we would probably call them the baby or the child. But in plants, we don't really refer to as the next generation as the children plants or the baby plants. Instead, we refer to them as the offspring. So we're kind of including all types of organisms when we say heredity is the passing of characteristics from the parents to the offspring. Now, we often call these characteristics, so these characteristics are called traits. So let's look at some examples of traits in human beings that might help us kind of understand a little bit. One of the traits or the characteristics that is passed down to you from your parents is the color of your eyes. So I'm going to put eye color. Another characteristic is the shape of your nose. Another one would be, can you roll your tongue or not? So I'm going to say rolling of tongue. Okay. So there's thousands of different traits that you inherited from your parents. We're just kind of talking about a few of those, but all living things inherit or pass down characteristics or traits from one generation to the next. So that's what Mendel was studying, is what is the connection between the parents and the offspring? What is it that's causing me to look like my parents, kind of, or why is it that one organism looks exactly like its parent? And so that's what he was curious about and what he studied. All right, so let me just stop here for just a second and add a little bit of color for emphasis. So I'm going to underline the word genetics, and then we're going to underline heredity. And in another color, let's underline the word traits to help those words stand out just a little bit. All right, let's take a closer look at this gentleman. Again, his name is Gregor. You'll hear Gregor Mendel or Gregor Mendel. Either way is correct. He was an Austrian. That's not Australian. It's a difference. Austria is over in Europe. He was an Austrian monk who discovered important facts about heredity by studying pea plants. He wasn't the only one doing studies on heredity at the time, but Gregor Mendel was very successful because he kept very detailed records, and he also used a mathematical approach, and that kind of gave him an edge on the competition over others who were also doing similar studies. And because of his findings, he has actually been given the title Father of Genetics. And he did most of his studies in the 1800s, about the mid-1800s. So it's quite a few years ago from you and I, but in the whole scheme of time, it's fairly recent. So again, I'm going to add a little bit of color emphasis here. I'm going to underline Gregor Mendel. He was the father of genetics, and he studied pea plants. He studied other organisms like bees, but he was most successful with the pea plant. I'm going to take just a second and turn my camera over to my computer because I want you to see just a short, about a 2-minute video from the Encyclopedia Britannica website about Gregor Mendel's life. So give me just a second. Let me focus here. All right, let me start the video.
Gregor Mendel lived as a Catholic monk in the 19th century. He resided in a monastery in what is today called Brno, Czech Republic. There, he discovered the basic laws of heredity. At the time, people needed an explanation for how living things could accurately create and recreate themselves generation after generation. What was the root of heredity? They knew the visible basic facts of how living things made more of themselves, but not much else.
That's not nice.
Mendel's tasks at his monastery kept him busy. For example, he tended at least 50 hives of bees, he reported his weather for the Austrian Empire, and his fellow monks elected him as the abbot of his monastery. More importantly for science, however, Mendel cultivated and studied thousands of pea plants in his garden. He kept precise records, he documented the qualities of his plants, and how he might breed different types of peas for purity or for blends of different features. He observed how parent plants passed their traits onto their offspring. Through this work, Mendel revealed for himself some basic properties of heredity. With heredity understood among peas, it wasn't long before the same principles were visible in other vegetables and trees. People began applying the idea of heredity to insects and large mammals and ultimately to humans themselves. Mendel showed that heredity was not caused by body cells, but by something that at the time was invisible in the sexual reproduction system. Mendel knew that both male and female reproduction systems contained heredity. As future research came to attest, heredity was embodied in what we call genes today.
All right, again, that was from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And let's quickly move back over to our notes because I think I'm getting ready to lose battery on my phone here. Okay, just a couple of things that I want you to also get down. Kind of understanding a little bit about, no, let's just look at what he studied, okay? Mendel studied seven traits. And the pea plants. Okay? But he only studied one trait at a time. And this was a good thing. We call this a mono-single hybrid cross. That's when we're looking at just one trait at a time. Okay, but there's usually two different versions of that trait. Okay, and so he was looking to see we could say observing if we wanted to be fancy. How traits were passed from parent to offspring. So, for example, okay, some of the pea plant traits We looked at some human traits earlier, but some of the pea plant traits that he noticed were height. And he noticed the plants were either tall or short. Okay, he looked at color. And he noticed the flowers were either yellow or pink. Purple. He looked at the seed shape. And he noticed the seeds were either round or wrinkled. Okay, those are just 3 of the 7 traits that he looked at. But every time he looked at these traits, he noticed one showed up while the other one sometimes showed up, but not all the time. And so we now call these terms dominant. Okay, and this is the trait that shows up. We say trait that is expressed. And I'll put in parentheses, that means shows up. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm off the camera screen. There we go. And then we have recessive. And this is the trait that's hidden. Okay? And we don't always see it from one generation to the next. So I'm going to stop here just a second and go back and highlight some of the important words. Okay, I'm going to highlight monohybrid cross. And then I'm going to go back and look at these words dominant versus recessive. You're definitely going to need to know there's about 6 main vocabulary words that you need to know in this unit. And those are the first 2 big words that we need to make sure that we understand. Okay, so the last thing I want to write down here at the bottom is that Mendel studied generation after generation after generation. And so when we're reading about his studies, we kind of need to understand how he talked about each generation. So the very first plants that he crossed together, he called the P1, that's a 1 generation, or the parental generation. Okay, their offspring, the babies of those parents, okay, he called them the F1 generation. And then the offspring of the F1 generation, guess what he called them? I'm sure you guessed right. F2 generation. And then it would just keep on going, F3, F4, and so on. So if you ever see a problem where it's talking about the F1 generation or the F2 generation, that's just referring to how far down the line you are from the original parent generation. All right, so we're going to stop there for today. We are going to learn a little bit more about Gregor Mendel's work in a different set of notes.